much for that introduction, Karen. Uh, Thanks to Mike Finch and the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And thanks all to you for coming. I'm extremely flattered and grateful to all of you. Many of you are old personal friends, some new friends, and some strangers who I hope are friends I just haven't met yet. I want to say a couple of words about the late David Horowitz before I start. I first encountered David's name in the tumultuous year of 1968 when I was a freshman or sophomore in college at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. And at that time, David was, as you know, a leftist son of communists who edited the Ramparts magazine, which was one of the most influential and well-done magazines on the left, and I read it religiously as the 60s evolved from that year of 68 through 1970 with the Kent State shootings. And many of you of my generation will remember what happened in those days and how split the country was. And David, as you know, made a pilgrimage from the left to the right and became a very prominent conservative anti-communist. And I don't need to go into all of his accomplishments here, but I want to start tonight with something David said just before his death. As my own death approaches, I weigh the life I have lived against what it might have been. I ask myself, could I have been wiser? Could I have done more? When I look at my life this way from the end, I can take satisfaction that I mostly gave it my all, and I did what I could. It is the certainty of death that finally makes a life acceptable. When we live as fully as we can, what room is left for regret? Another very close friend of mine died recently, the great American essayist Lance Morrow, who adopted me when I was a young fledgling beginner at Time magazine in New York, plucked out of the obscurity of the San Francisco Examiner to come to New York to become the classical music critic of Time, at a time when Time magazine meant something. And Lance is the dedicatee of this book we're talking about tonight, A Rage to Conquer. He was not only a colleague, but more importantly, a personal friend. He lives near me in the countryside. I live in extreme western rural New England, and he lived just across the New York state line in the Hudson Valley. But we socialized a lot, we talked a lot, and it's what we talked about that I want to talk to you about tonight. There's a saying in the military, and I should mention, by the way, that I'm not just a fan of the military. I was born into the United States Marine Corps at the base at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and grew up at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, and then in Honolulu, Hawaii for a few years, and 8th and I, the Marine headquarters in Washington. So typical Marine Corps family. We moved around an awful lot, which is challenging because you have to kind of forget your friends and move on. We didn't have social media or phones, cell phones in those days. So once you left, and you generally never saw those people again. It makes you self-reliant, hopefully, and very resourceful, and it was certainly very helpful for me as I undertook my career, especially at Time, where, because I speak German, I wound up as a foreign correspondent, and I was, I was in 1985, I was at the East German celebration of, or commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Dresden, at which point my accompanist, the East German government would assign you someone to go with you to make sure you were not a spy or getting into mischief. And he said, I just want to warn you, there's a new KGB resident in town, and his name is Vladimir Putin. As it happened, I ran directly into Erich Honecker, the former East German chief, but I never did meet Putin, but like David Horowitz's name, Putin's name has been with me, not that they're any remotely similar, for a long, long time. But it's these conversations that make a writer what he is. And the third conversation I'm just going to mention briefly is the other day I was talking to an old friend of mine. I've known her since we were both 18 years old, and students at the Eastman School of Music. She's an outstanding international concert pianist. And I am privileged to have two classic Steinway pianos in my house in New England. So we were talking about instruments, and she's going to come over in a few weeks and play at a party that I'm giving. And we started talking about one thing very specific, and that is a piece called Valet Dobermann by Franz Liszt, the great Hungarian-born pianist of the 19th century, and one of the most influential men of the 19th century. When artists talk, when military people talk, when writers talk, what do you think we talk about? We don't talk about the subject we're writing about. Hardly ever does that come up. The saying in the military is, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. I would say among professional writers, we never ask each other, what are you working on, except in the broadest possible sense. But we ask, what is it? What structurally? How are you making it work? What is your plan for, like an architect building a building? How does it lay out? And with Lance Morrow, who was a peerless essayist, I could talk to him about his crystalline perfection of a sentence, and he would talk to me about how do you write these big, long novels with big structural pillars that hold them up. And we never tired of talking shop, in a way. And so with my friend Janice Weber, I was talking shop about this Liszt piece, Valet Dobermann, and I said, why does Liszt double the third in the final chord of Valet Dobermann? Now that may sound like something of such minimal interest as to be barely worth talking about. But for pianists and musicians, it's all the difference in the world. And why do I bring this up? Because in classical harmony, that is to say from the time of Bach to the present, you have a chord that has a root, has a third, major or minor, and a fifth, and that's the chord. What you never do is double the third. So let's take, for example, E major, and the third in E major is G sharp. If you have a final chord, there's only going to be one G sharp in that chord, generally speaking. So you've got the bass E, B, E, and in the right hand, E, G sharp, B, E. But Liszt doubles the third. And he doubles the third right after a chord that doesn't resolve the tonality into E major, what you think he's going to do. Instead, he hits an augmented E chord, which is E, G sharp, C. And an augmented chord in classical music practice and theory is very destabilizing. It does not resolve anything. And after this long journey we have made with the composer and the pianist who's playing it, to have it end on such a note of uncertainty and compound the uncertainty with this double G sharp is something that pianists talk about all the time. Now, this piece was based on a very, very influential French novel from 1804, an epistolary novel called Obermann, written by Etienne Pivert de Senancourt, which followed another very influential epistolary novel, Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, and that came out in 1787. That book was famous for causing an epidemic of suicide among young men all over Europe. The story of a man who loses the woman he loves because she marries a rich guy and forsakes him. He shoots himself to death on Christmas Eve, just resonated with the young people of the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So when Liszt decided to run off with another man's wife, which was not an unusual thing for Liszt, shall we say, he did it twice, and make her his mistress, and they traveled all over Europe together. He was, at that time, beginning his famous career as a piano virtuoso. She left her older French husband and their children, and they went off to Switzerland, and Liszt memorialized this in a series of piano pieces called the Années de Pèlerinage, Years of Pilgrimage, and the first book is Switzerland, Suisse. And Valet Dobermann is the centerpiece of this work. And Liszt, because he was a literary man, he attached some epigraphs to the score, and one of them was from Senancourt. Que veux-je? Que suis-je? Que demander à la nature? Who am I? What do I want? What am I asking from nature? And this is crucial. The 19th century, as we're going from the Rococo period of the 18th century, moving into the 19th century, especially in Germany, is a world of forests and mountains and natural beauty. They were the original ecologists. They found beauty in a stream. And they wrote poems about it, they wrote music about it, they wrote novels about it. It obsessed everybody. And the second epigraph that Liszt attached to this score was from the poet Lord Byron. But as it is, I live and die unheard, with a most voiceless thought, sheathing it as a sword. Now, this is all going to come together, so don't despair, I promise. And we'll come back to Byron in a bit. But follow the bouncing ball. This is what I think I have made a kind of specialty of mine, cultural lineage from one event and person to another. And in this case, I would say Mozart, and you'll see why, the French Revolution, Without the Marriage of Figaro, which was a play by Beaumarchais, turned into an opera by Mozart. There is no French Revolution. The arts paved the way for the acceptability of criticizing the nobility, which is what Mozart does in his famous comic opera. But like everything Mozart does, it's not really funny. It's deadly serious. What is the result of the French Revolution? Napoleon. The French Revolution overthrew the monarchy and replaced it with an emperor. But along the way, Napoleon seized power, almost chickened out, but did, became the first consul of the post-revolutionary government in France, and then later crowned himself the Emperor of the French. Just at the time Napoleon has embarked on his conquest of Europe, the first 10 years of the 19th century, almost simultaneously, Beethoven writes the Eroica Symphony. The Eroica Symphony is twice as long as any symphony that has come before it. It is in 4 giant movements. It is in 3/4 time, the first movement, and it is in E-flat major. Why did he do that? Because, as we started this line with Mozart, Mozart's 39th Symphony is in E-flat major, and it is in 3/4 time. Very rare to have a first movement in a classical structure in 3/4 time. So Beethoven is clearly indicating the influence of Mozart. But in the size and the scope and the ambition, he is reflecting Napoleon. In fact, he dedicates the symphony to Napoleon. At the same time, Napoleon's guns are just outside of Vienna. And in fact, at some of the early performances of the Eroica Symphony, which is the third, Napoleon's troops are in the audience, listening to it. Beethoven triggered an outpouring of romanticism. He straddles the gap between the classical period and the romantic period. Napoleon and Beethoven are the same person for the purposes of this discussion. And who did Napoleon influence? Well, yes, he was a great general, and one of the chapters of this book is on his masterpiece at Austerlitz against the Russians and the Austrians. But he had a greater influence on the artists of his day. Why? Because Napoleon himself was a novelist. We forget this. He began as an aspiring young novelist. Now remember, this man is a complete outsider. He's not even French, for one thing. He doesn't even learn how to speak French very well, for another. He's a member of a very minor Italian family in Corsica, which at the time of his birth had just come under French suzerainty. But he makes his way in the world all by himself. And why I argue in this book, Napoleon is the first romantic. He is the first modern man. He's the first man to say, I can do this and I don't care what you think, and I will do it my way and you will like it, or you will lump it. And so that was just what the artists of the 19th century wanted to hear. We are free. We are free of the courts. Beethoven had to be aware of courtly patronage, so did Mozart. Not Liszt. He just came and he went, took other men's wives with him. He was the first professional concert pianist. He invented that career. But just before Liszt comes Byron, who adores Napoleon. And Byron, again, is one of these rare birds in Western history who does it his way. Everything about Byron, again, a minor noble family, but a profligate spender, a man of omnisexuality, I suppose we would say. When Byron was in town, no page boy or chambermaid was safe. Byron wrote a number of poems about Napoleon. After Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, Byron was inconsolable and bought, with somebody else's money, of course, a carriage that was the exact replica of what the emperor had taken to the Waterloo battlefield. Byron gives us the term Byronic. That is, someone dashing and handsome and strong and doesn't care what you think and is going to do it his way. And as you know, he died young. He had to leave England because his homosexuality or bisexuality would have brought him into severe legal trouble in England at that time. He traveled across Europe. He befriended Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe, who weren't married either, by the way, and in fact believed in complete free love. And one of my favorite Byron stories, you all probably know, is that year, I think 1814, I forget exactly, was the year without a summer. There had been a volcanic eruption in the South Pacific, and there was no summer in Europe. It rained the whole time. But they had all met up at a villa in Geneva. And because the weather was so awful, they stayed inside having sex with each other and drinking absinthe and taking drugs and hallucinating. And one night they decided that they had to tell each other ghost stories. This is where Frankenstein comes from. This is where Dracula comes from, indirectly, from a Byron fragmented short story that was later developed by his own personal physician who was there, and then by Bram Stoker. So Byron's influence is radiating out in all directions, and Liszt picks that up. He's slightly younger. He's born in 1811. He's a prodigy, of course. He's run off with Marie, the Countess d'Agoult, in his 20s. They have 3 children, one of whom later went on to marry Richard Wagner. You almost can't make this up, the connections among these people. But Liszt thought of himself as a Byronic figure. He was dashing, he was extremely handsome. Women could not stop throwing themselves at him. He moved around Europe on his own recognizance. I mean, they would never ask him for his papers because they knew who it was. He was that famous and that influential. And one of the points I want to make tonight is to say that the arts have always been this influential. It's only in our time that we've become so Philistinic that we don't appreciate the arts anymore. We think of them as something that belongs in a museum or something that's of no interest to us whatsoever. But if you look at the history of the 19th century, it's always the artists who lead this stuff. And when Napoleon goes to Austerlitz, he pulls off a masterpiece like a painter. It's one of the very few times in military history that everything he planned went exactly right, and he destroyed Emperor Alexander's army and the army of the Emperor of the Austrian Empire. But he was animated by this individualistic, very politically liberal notion. And we know this because Wagner was one of the revolutionaries in the revolutions of 1848, a wanted man, and later wound up marrying Liszt's daughter, and Liszt, even though he was only 2 years older than Wagner, became his father-in-law. These connections are not accidental, but they are sometimes invisible. So I mentioned that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. Amateurs will look at a battle map and say, well, I would have moved this division here, and I would have come over here, and and the professional says, how are you going to get them there? One division's 3-day march away. One is out of water. One has no food. One is only a paper division. Its strength is down by 50% because of casualties in previous battle. So how are you going to do that? And I mentioned that in writing, the same thing is also true. We talk sentence structure, design. Forget what it's about. We don't care what it's about. Any professional writer will tell you that people come up to you all the time and say, I've got a great story for you. And I say, I don't want to hear it. I can think of my own stories all by my little old self. Even in Hollywood, we have some Hollywood people here, and I've been privileged to work in that industry, the industry, for a long time now. Writers have a saying that, especially of movie critics, unless you've been in the room, the term being for when writers go in, meet with producers, or give a pitch, or something at which something will be decided, that is, in the room, unless you've been in the room, you don't know what you're talking about. And that the movie you see on the screen is something vastly different because it goes through such a transformative process from what you're talking about to the producers or your agents or whoever else is working on it. So it comes back to this notion of experience and how important that experience is, but also what came before. A lot of times in a movie pitch, if the producer or the studio executive is bright, and most of them are, they'll say, oh, that's like whatever, and they'll mention a movie. And you say, yes, and it's the old joke is it's Jaws meets Going My Way, or something like that. Which is a movie I'd like to write, actually. I think it'd be pretty funny. It would take place off the coast of Ireland, because we got plenty of sharks out there. So you have to know what you're talking about. And this brings me to this main point, which is Clausewitz. Karl von Clausewitz was a Prussian military officer who was captured at the battles of Jena, Auerstedt. Jena, Auerstedt are in the sort of center of Germany in Thuringia, near Saxony. East Germany was when I first went there. And Napoleon, this is after Austerlitz, had crushed them again. In fact, he destroyed the Prussian army, and Clausewitz was taken prisoner. And he was sent back to France as a very pampered prisoner because he was, again, a minor noble, and he was on the Prussian general staff. So he had a fairly comfy exile in Paris. And while he was there, he wrote this famous book called On War, Vom Kriege in German. And it's kind of like St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica about war. It's very long. He didn't live to finish it. He died relatively young of cholera, during cholera epidemic. But he says a couple of things in that book that have moved into the language. Oddly enough, one of them, the most famous, is a complete mistranslation. One little word, one tiny little difference between major and minor, but it makes all the difference in the world. You may know Clausewitz's dictum that war is politics by other means. And so, for my sins and to cut my time in purgatory short, I read the first big book of Vom Kriege in German. And I was immediately struck that that's not what he says at all. He says, der Krieg ist eine bloße Fortsetzung der Politik mit anderen Mitteln. Not by, mit, with. So what he's saying is war is eine bloße Fortsetzung, is merely bloße continuation of politics or policy, depending on the context of the word, with other means. So what that means is, war is not a thing that after everything else has failed, you do it. War is what you use as a stick. He also goes on to say, in war, there are no militarily limiting principles on the amount of force you can use. That is strictly a political decision. But the generals are not supposed to think about that. They've given an objective, win. Ulysses S. Grant kept the United States together with that philosophy. And it will be the politicians who will say, stop. It will be Churchill and Eisenhower who tell Patton, stop. We were going to let the Russians take Moscow because they had suffered more casualties in the East than we had, obviously. And it was a political decision, in part, to keep Stalin in the tent. There are all these laws about engaging with the enemy. There's von Moltke's law in in the 19th century. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. Mike Tyson rephrased that. Everybody has a plan until he gets hit in the mouth. And then there's Murphy's Law, which is anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And Clausewitz calls this friction. He compares war to a giant machine, which is not just got parts touching each other at various places, but all the parts are bumping into each other simultaneously, which occasions him to write, everything about war is simple, but the simplest things can be very difficult. He says, im Kriege ist alles einfach, aber das Einfache höchst schwierig ist. And that is accurately translated. And then he goes on to say, die Hauptsache ist die Schwierigkeit der Ausführung. And the main challenge is the difficulty of execution. That's why professionals talk logistics. How do I do it? Very important. So picture war as a giant machine. All the parts are scraping against each other, and some are flying off, and some get lost. Clausewitz also never said the fog of war, by the way, just as Sherlock Holmes never said elementary, my dear Watson. Very similar. But he says the instrument of war is like a machine with enormous friction, which, unlike in mechanics, cannot be reduced to a few points, but is everywhere in contact with a host of contingencies. So von Moltke is absolutely right. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. No fight goes the way of the first fighter who gets hit in the mouth thinks it's going to go, and Murphy's Law coming in. I'm fascinated by this concept of the merging of an artistic impulse, which Napoleon has. Don't forget, he's a novelist at heart, and a lover, not really a fighter. He does, as a young officer, he became known as the little corporal. He was never a corporal, but he was an artilleryman, and he was obsessed with topography. Any Marine will tell you that the topography, or Army officer for that matter, even Army officers know this. I'm saying this because my friend Colonel Schlechter is giving me the finger in the back there. That you must take the topography, the weather, all sorts of things into account as you make your battle plan. And it is the greatest commanders who take this into account and who choose the battlefield they want. If you go back to the beginning of warfare, the Greeks and the Romans, you will note that the two sides would come face to face, and then they would kind of futz around for 2 or 3 days. as they sought to get the terrain they wanted to have the fight on. And then in the Greco-Roman period, they would issue an invitation to the bad guys, the other side, to fight. It was an offer of battle. And they could say, nah, not today. And then you wouldn't have a fight. You'd just sit there. Until both sides thought they had the upper hand in the territory and in the strategic situation, and then you would have a fight. It's my theory, as I've written Last Stands and this book, that the great man theory of history is actually true. That as much as it is derided, I believe the evidence shows that it's crucial to have the right commander at the helm. Now, someone who didn't believe this, I'll get to him first, is Tolstoy. And if you read War and Peace, which I did a couple of years ago now, for the first time, in English, obviously, you will see that Tolstoy has nothing but contempt for Napoleon. Napoleon comes off as a kind of pathetic, tubby, pink, vain little man. And yet, the very first sentence of War and Peace, one of the minor characters, the woman hosting the party, talks about, well, Bonaparte has done this, now he'll do that. In other words, this monster, it's a monster movie story. The monster's shadow is over it, right from the beginning. And yet Tolstoy, when he comes to write his great novel about Napoleon, I like to say that War and Peace is actually two books. It's the tale of the princess who sleeps with all the princes until she finally decides to marry the richest one of them. That would be Pierre. And then it's a war novel about Napoleon against Kutuzov. Because he's taking on this vast, cataclysmic conflict between Russia and Western Europe, he feels compelled to disparage Napoleon. I'll just read a couple of things here from his very long hatchet job on Napoleon. Along comes a man with no convictions, no customs, no traditions, no name, not even a Frenchman. And he works his way, seemingly by a series of curious chances, through the ferment of party conflict in France, and ends up in a prominent position without attaching himself to any particular party. He finds himself in charge of the army, thanks to the incompetence of his colleagues, the spinelessness of his piffling opponents, and his own barefaced duplicity, bravura, and narrow-minded overconfidence. The brilliance of the Italian soldiers, the reluctance of his opponents to take up arms, together with his boyish cockiness and overconfidence, win him military glory. Everywhere he is assisted by a string of what you might call chance contingencies. When he falls into disfavor with the French government, this soon becomes an advantage. Every effort of his to change the course of his destiny comes to nothing. He's rejected for service in Russia, and he cannot get himself posted to Turkey. Now, as you know, Napoleon did eventually achieve a command position in the French army and went to Egypt as first consul of the French state that was emerging between the revolution and his own imperial ambitions. And while he was there, Admiral Nelson burned his fleet to pieces. Napoleon never did understand naval warfare, and twice Admiral Nelson burned his fleet to pieces, at Trafalgar, most famously. Napoleon fought a war against the Egyptians, who were then controlled by the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes were a slave class under the Islamic government of Egypt, who had overtaken their masters, who grew fat and indolent and lazy, and the Mamelukes ruled the Egyptian Muslim empire for many, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years. Napoleon defeated them and slaughtered the Mamelukes in a war crime for which he was never held responsible. He even brought a Mameluke home with him to France. He brought, in fact, a whole unit of them home and made him his personal valet. What Tolstoy is saying here is that Napoleon's rise to power and his success on the battlefield was luck, pure, dumb, stupid luck. It is chance, says Tolstoy, that determines the personalities of those who rule France at this time and now cringe before him. Chance Austerlitz. And chance determines that all men, not only the French, but every country in Europe except England, which will have no involvement in the events about to unfold, set aside their former horror and repugnance at his criminality, and now legitimize the power he has acquired, the title he has bestowed on himself, that is, Emperor of the French, and his ideal concept of greatness and glory, which appeals to everybody as something splendidly reasonable. Now, I disagree with the great Tolstoy about the nature of the Napoleonic ability, mostly because I've spent so much time researching his life. Lord Andrew Roberts, who some of you may know, is a British peer and the most famous living Napoleonic scholar, and he assisted me greatly with the thought about this chapter, but the idea that Napoleon is the first romantic hero is entirely mine. I mentioned about the chord change in the list. There's a famous pop song from the 40s, I think, called Every Time We Say Goodbye, recorded by Ella Fitzgerald, among many other great artists. In the line that everyone remembers from this song is, "When you are near, there's such an air of spring about it. I can hear a lark somewhere begin to sing about it. There's no love song finer, but how strange the change from major to minor. Every time we say goodbye." An E major chord is bright, optimistic, cheery. An E minor chord is dark. And it's just one note, which is why I think you should not fall for the argument that, a specious argument in my opinion, that because chimpanzees share 98.9% of their genes or whatever it is with us, we're not that different. We're entirely different. And guess what? That 1% made all the difference. If I end a piece in E minor instead of E major, you will know it. All other things being equal. So Liszt doubles the third. Seems like a minor point, not. You've gone on this journey with him, with the young man of Senancour's book. You've despaired of civilization. You've gone into the Swiss Alps. You're wandering around. It's very, very romantic. It's hard to read today because it's so sort of gushy. But you hope he'll find some solace. And in the music, it goes through all these changes. But what never changes is the main melody, which is just 3 notes. It's 3 words. I read it in French earlier. Que suis-je? Who am I? What am I? Where am I going? That's what the music's about. And Liszt doesn't want you to think that this hero has found it because he hasn't, because he doesn't know. And he leaves you first with this augmented 6th chord, which is wildly destabilizing after this big virtuoso run of double octaves, all wet keys. And then he resolves to a thing that is inherently unstable. And we know this story is not over. It will be continued. Goethe, who I mentioned earlier, encountered Napoleon. In fact, Napoleon asked for Goethe, as if you need further proof that Napoleon was a man of the arts. And he, after the battles of, this was sometime after the battles of Jena and Auerstadt, but Goethe lived in Weimar, where Liszt also lived many years later. And he summoned the great man, the most famous man in Europe at that point, Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German poet and writer and general polymath, to come and see him. And Goethe wrote an account of it. He said, "I am called into the emperor's study. He is eating breakfast. On his right, at some distance from the table, is Talleyrand. On his left, the Count Pierre-Antoine Daru, his military aide, with whom he discusses taxes. The emperor signals me to approach. I remain standing in front of him at a suitable distance." It's important to remember here, in this context, that Goethe is reporting that Napoleon was many things. He codified the law, for one thing, and the Napoleonic Code is still in use in France and in South America, oddly enough, widely still in use. He changed the economic system of Europe, something he called the continental system. He went to the theater, as did Ulysses Grant, by the way. He's a huge patron of plays, and it is purely the fact that Grant's wife and Mary Lincoln hated each other that Grant did not go to our American cousin the night that Lincoln was assassinated. Or Grant might have been assassinated by Booth as well. After looking at me for a moment, he says to me, "You are a man." I bow my head. He says, "How old are you?" 60 years. "You are well preserved. You have written some tragedies." He then brought the conversation to Werther, which he must have studied in detail. After several perfectly appropriate observations, he mentioned a specific part and said to me, "Why did you do that?" He's not asking about the plot of Werther. He's asking about the technique used by Goethe in this particular passage. It is not natural, he says. And he spoke at length on this and with perfect accuracy. I listened with a calm face, and I replied with a smile of satisfaction that I didn't know whether anyone had ever made the same criticism, but that I found it perfectly justified, and that I agreed that one could find fault with this passage's lack of authenticity. But, I added, a poet can perhaps be excused for taking refuge in an artifice which is hard to spot when he wants to produce certain effects that could not be created simply and naturally. This is what every artist, every screenwriter who tries an adaptation, every author such as myself who wrote a book about a dead but living man and wrote it in his voice, we all think that at some point we have to change the story to make it work. So that's why you can't just do a book and make a movie out of it. You have to obey the strictures and rules of the art form, and that goes for war fighting and battlefields every bit as much as it goes for scripts or novels. The emperor seemed to agree with me. He returned to drama and made some very sensible remarks. By the way, Napoleon brought the entire Comédie Française with him to this meeting so he could show the Germans that he appreciated culture and that he, like them, prized it very highly. Sensible remarks as a man who had observed the tragic stage with a great deal of attention, like a criminal judge, and who felt very deeply how far French theater had strayed from nature and truth. That's Senancour. Who am I? Where am I going? What is this world I find myself in? What is my part? What role do I play? It's the antithesis of Tolstoy saying it's all luck. Tolstoy is really a nihilist. But Napoleon contravenes and refutes that notion. He went on to talk about fatalistic plays, of which he disapproved. Again, individuality. They belonged to the Dark Ages. Why today do they keep giving us destiny? Napoleon asks Goethe. Destiny is politics. Separate. Finally, to reduce friction, how do we do it in our lives? We all have friction in our lives. Simplicity was the answer of the Romantics, no matter how complicated their structures become. So we can go from the Mozart 39th Symphony to the Beethoven Heroic Symphony, through the great Romantic music of mid-century to Richard Strauss's Ein Heldenleben, which is, in German, the hero's life, a hero's life, and in which Strauss, in his greatest orchestral tone poem, makes himself the hero of his own story. And he does so with a 130-piece orchestra that is just amazing to hear in person. That's the way artists chase their destiny. To paraphrase Clausewitz, everything in life is simple, but the simplest things are very, very difficult. For example, what do we prize in music that's perfect? What is perfect? Well, one thing is the overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream by Felix Mendelssohn. He was a teenager when he wrote it. You would not change one note of that piece. It is absolutely perfect. One that I would like to have played at my funeral is the intermezzo from Cavalleria Rusticana. which both Scorsese and Coppola have used in their films. It's just a 2-minute long orchestral piece, but it sums up all of the pathos of life that the opera is reflecting and the foreshadowing of doom that our poor hero is going to meet in the second half of this opera. But it's perfect. And where does this search for perfection come from? This brings us back to Goethe. We round out with Goethe. Goethe's most famous play is Faust, as you know, Faust Part 1, Faust Part 2, but especially Faust Part 1. That is the Faustian bargain story. And what is the Faustian bargain story? We get this wrong all the time. Faust does not have Mephistopheles appear in his study. After complaining that he has studied every discipline on the world, the very famous opening monologue of Faust, and here I stand, poor fool, no wiser than I was before. So we have thought that Mephistopheles offers him rule of the world, full command of everything, if he gives up his soul to the devil on his death. That's not the bargain. No, not even close. Faust already knows everything there is to know. He's not interested in it. He can't learn anymore. He loves literally everything there is. He's missing one element in his life. I'll read it in German and in English because I want you to hear the poetry of it and get a sense of what it's about. Faust says to Mephisto, "Werde ich zum Augenblick sagen, verweile doch, du bist so schön." If I find a moment where I can say, stay just a little while, a moment of absolute perfect happiness, I will give up my soul. Dann magst du mich in Fesseln schlagen, you may throw me in chains. Dann will ich gern zugrunde gehen, you can pull me down. Dann mag die Totenglocke schallen, let the death bells ring. Dann bist du deines Dienstes frei, then you are free of any obligation to me, he says to Mephisto. Die Uhr mag stehen, the clock has stopped. Der Zeiger fallen, the hands not moving. Es sei die Zeit für mich vorbei. When I have that perfect moment in which everything stops, it's a moment of sexual ecstasy, it's a moment of professional accomplishment, it's a moment of whatever it is. If I could see such thing once, I would give you my soul. And that's the Faustian bargain. It's interesting in our lives, and I'm now 75 and a half, that the apogee of your career is only evident in retrospect. And you also know, although you don't as a young man, that when you reach the peak, the only way forward is down. You have now reached the beginning of your own professional or personal end. And it is so how we as men, people, women too, deal with that transition that comes for everybody. Napoleon at Austerlitz is the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. He later says, if I only had the army of Austerlitz at Waterloo, I would have cleaned his cloth. And he would have. He would have. But he had passed the peak. So to succeed is ultimately to fail. This is the human paradox. To win the battle is ultimately to lose it. Napoleon kind of wins Borodino. And the Russians burn Moscow. And that does Napoleon in, because he gets caught beyond his lines of supply, and winter destroys the Grande Armée. This is the Faustian bargain we have all had forced upon us, but still we seek it. There's a play by George Bernard Shaw. Fabian socialist that he was, man who never consummated his marriage to his wife, oddball extraordinaire, great dramatist, beloved by music critics because Shaw actually started as a music critic in London. And he wrote this to the opening to his play, Caesar and Cleopatra, which if you don't know that play, I highly recommend it. It's a May-December romance between Caesar, who's balding and fat and past his prime. He's now in his 50s, and Cleopatra's 18. So Shaw says this, the more ignorant men are, the more convinced are they that their little parish and their little chapel is an apex to which civilization and philosophy have painfully struggled up the pyramid of time from a desert of savagery. Savagery, they think, became barbarism. Barbarism became ancient civilization. Ancient civilization became Pauline Christianity. Pauline Christianity became Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism became the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages were finally enlightened by the Protestant instincts of the English race. The whole process is summed up as progress with a capital P. Shaw, a cynic, of course, the play Caesar and Cleopatra, profoundly cynical and touching at the end when Caesar leaves her, but sends Mark Antony in his place. So this is a kind of plea to see history holistically, and not in the fashionable vogue word term, but as a unity, that these players, such as Goethe and Liszt and Beethoven, and the Senancour, and all of the artists who create the intellectual and emotional world in which the political and military figures move. Bewegen is the German word, and Clausewitz at one point says, war moves, floats through this air of threat and danger and stress. If we see this whole picture, and not just the little picture, we won't talk tactics anymore. We'll talk logistics. How do we get there? What do I do? What is my purpose in life? Where am I going? It's something we all ask. We don't get an answer for it. But we would get better public policy people, we would get better teachers, better students, and a clearer grasp of where we are in our own moment in life. And we can all agree, I think, what a moment it is to be alive now with all of the contention and strife and political back and forthing and the way the world has changed since the end of World War II. We are witnessed and cursed to deal with it. The men I write about in this book, Alexander the Great, when he crushes Darius at Gaugamela, Napoleon at Austerlitz, when he takes Alexander's tactics and uses it on the Russians. Same battle, exactly the same battle. And you can bet Napoleon knew it because he studied Caesar and he studied Alexander. Alexander studied the Iliad. Caesar at the Battle of Alesia, a battle we don't talk about very much, but where he conquered Gaul finally after 10 years, finds himself with walls on either side of him. So does Beaumont, the great Norman warrior at Antioch. And how did they get out? They solved it in exactly the same way, which is if you are outnumbered, which they both were, you concentrate your forces on the enemy's weak spot and break him, break his line. And they did. They both won. By understanding these threads, we can learn. Otherwise, as Santayana observed, we really are doomed to repeat it. First time as tragedy, second time as farce, as Karl Marx said. Marx attempted to find a de-Christianized version of teleology in his Hegelian dialectic of constant thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Far better to remember the success of Occam's razor strokes as expressed in the old proverb once familiar to every schoolchild, but today forgotten. For want of a horse, the battle was lost. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. Thank you very much.